The dangerous part about peptide stacks is that some of them work strongly enough to create problems you were never thinking about. So if you've heard about CJC 1295, Tesamorelin, Ipamorelin, Follistatin, IGF-LR3 for muscle, for recovery, or for fat loss, you're probably asking the same question most men ask first, which is, what is the strongest stack that I can use? But that's usually the wrong question. That question can get you in trouble, because the strongest sounding stack might be pushing a pathway that was never your limiting factor in the first place. That's why the free peptide decision matrix is the first link in the description, because you can use that to get information before you do anything else. Now, my name is Rafael Al-Najaar. I'm a medical doctor specializing in men's hormonal health, fertility, and performance, and I work with peptides basically every day. And the thing with peptides is the work is not simply understanding whether they can increase your IGF-1 or growth hormone. And so in this video, we'll understand the basic IGF-1 and growth hormone pathway, why CJC or Tesamorelin usually gets paired with Ipamorelin, why IGF-LR3 and Follistatin belongs in the red zone, and in the end, I'll give you the 5 questions you need to answer before stacking any peptide. Now, peptides are popular because they feel like precision. You have a vial that has a name, you're following a protocol, and it's probably stacked with different vials and peptides. And so you feel very advanced, more advanced than just using something like a supplement bottle. But the issue is this creates false confidence. And this matters because I've seen this all around with TRT, with peptides, even with supplements, where the intervention becomes the identity. You've probably already seen a guy who will see himself as what he's doing. So his intervention, if he's on TRT, if he's a bodybuilder who's using very strong steroids, or even someone who's using peptides, they will look at every single issue they have and they will just throw that same thing at it, whether that's TRT or peptides or whatever it is. And it's an issue because this type of man will stop asking what his body actually needs, and he won't try to fix the underlying issue that he has. And so he just starts using whatever he can find is the most advanced protocol there is. And that's simply just very expensive guessing with a syringe. And I'll give you an example. One of my clients, Derek, who's been a bodybuilder for 10 years, who's been on TRT throughout this whole period. He did this, and this was him. He looked bigger, he looked more vascular on TRT. But later he described the differences in his mental ability, his sleep quality, and the physical direction after coming off of the TRT, working through a proper plan as night and day. And that's the exact point here, because you can be on something that from the outside looks very advanced, but on the inside, you're not even fixing the underlying issue. And so even though I am a hormone doctor, I give out TRT, I work with peptides, I always talk about fixing your foundation first, fixing the underlying issue before you start doing some of these more advanced things. Because when you start working with peptides that has anything to do with growth hormone signaling, this becomes very dangerous. And so this video is obviously not medical advice, it's only for information and education. It's just because I see how much information there is out there that's targeted towards making men reach for the peptides as the first thing. And I think that's a very wrong decision to make. So now you understand that, let's get a bit deeper into the video. If we have a look at the screen, we can see the growth pathway described on how GH actually works, so growth hormone, right? Because you will have a growth hormone pulse that starts in the pituitary gland, which signals to the liver and other tissues to produce IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1. And this then has downstream growth signaling. So this is where we see the body-wide effects with an increase in metabolism, muscle recovery, fat burn. You have connective tissue that's being further enhanced. And overall, you have an improved body composition. And that's why it makes so much sense that bodybuilders and biohackers alike will be attracted by something that does this. Now, the FDA label for Tesamorelin states that it stimulates growth hormone secretion and it increases IGF-1 and IGF-BP3. And in endocrinology, we know that an increase in GH and IGF-1 is connected to acromegaly, which is a multi-system disease with soft tissue growth and metabolic complications. So the point here is very simple. This is not caffeine. This is not simple pre-workout. This can be very advanced stuff that you're playing with. Now, that doesn't mean that every growth hormone peptide causes acromegaly. That would simply be an overstatement. Because the correct lesson is probably more precise. We know that benefit and risk, they share a pathway. Because just like you will have an improved recovery and improved body comp if you push the signal more, you can also risk that you will retain more fluid, your glucose sensitivity will change, so basically your risk of getting diabetes sleep apnea will probably be worse. And this will lead you to ask another question. Should you even start on this type of peptide if you already have sleep apnea? And some of these are basically IGF-1 decisions, because more signaling is not automatically better. Because what happens if your IGF-1 is elevated? And we've talked about the pathway. We haven't even talked about the baseline IGF-1, fasting glucose, insulin resistance, blood pressure, cancer history, which is probably the most important thing here to mention, or what should make you stop if something goes wrong. And so once you understand that pathway, the stacking logic becomes easy to understand. And this is also where many men start making wrong assumptions. So let's talk about why CJC or tesamorelin gets stacked with Ipamorelin. Because the common stack logic is signal plus amplifier. You will have CJC or tesamorelin, which is growth hormone releasing hormones analogs. So they basically tell the pituitary gland to be ready. And then you have the Ipamorelin will then tell the pituitary gland, the gland right here behind your nose, to trigger and release growth hormone. And so in online forums, on X, on Twitter, whatever, the idea will become that the first side, the CJC or tesamorelin, will tell the pituitary gland to be ready, and the Ipamorelin will then execute and pull the trigger. And that's why this stack sounds so elegant. And I understand the appeal, because a man will hear that this is the signal plus the pulse, and he might think it's controlled, it's a smarter way, instead of just taking growth hormone. And maybe it is, because it sounds elegant. But the issue is pharmacology isn't the same thing as the right clinical decision. And these are the mild options first. You also have something like sermorelin, which is framed as a milder GHRH analog or GRF. And you have tesamorelin, which is an approved drug used for patients with HIV to help them remove their abdominal visceral fat. But that approved use does not mean or doesn't transfer to a healthy man who's trying to put on muscle or drop some of the weight. And this is where precision matters, because I don't hate the tools at all. You just have to understand these are tools that you have to use in the proper context. The right question is not whether the mechanism sounds plausible. The right question is whether the man in front of me has a reason to push this type of pathway, and whether we know what we are tolerating if it actually moves. Because two men can use the same stack, but they will be different. In one, he will have his insulin resistance change. Maybe he has sleep apnea. Maybe he has fertility plans. Or maybe he has cancer history in his family. And so these two different men using the same stack will lead to two different outcomes and should lead to two different decisions as well. Because one might need this type of stack, while the other might need proper food and proper sleep before he even touches a syringe. And so this brings us to the section people really stand for, the advanced peptides that sound like the fast lane. Now, let's talk about the red zone. Because the red zone consists of IGF-LR3 and Follistatin. And so you shouldn't see this as every single peptide is evil. You just need to understand that decision layer, the decision layer that we're using on this, becomes thinner when the promise gets bigger. Because we will know IGF-1 as a direct anabolic signal, so improving your muscle growth. And Follistatin sounds like a shortcut around muscle restraint. It is a part of the signal in the myostatin biology. And what we know is this is part of how we naturally decrease our muscle mass. And so if you can avoid decreasing your muscle mass, you can keep more muscle. And this is what Follistatin promises to deliver, basically. So you have one that increases your muscle mass, the IGF-LR3, or at least that's the promise. And then you have one that decreases how much muscle mass you lose automatically. And this sounds like a perfect combination, but you guessed it right, it isn't. Because when you have peptides like this, you shouldn't ask, how jacked can you be? You should ask, what's the human evidence? What's the downside if the pathway overshoots? What happens in a man with poor glucose control? And what happens in a man with family or even personal history of cancer risk? How much can he tolerate? And this is the part a lot of the online talk on X, on Reddit, wherever, on peptides that gets lost, because it kills the fantasy that especially these two peptides or any other growth hormone peptide stack works like magic. And we haven't even talked about contamination, legal status, immune reactions, repeat labs, how you should stop, what your stop signals should be, or the difference between mechanistic plausibility and actual clinical evidence. And so if you understand that the question is no longer what is the strongest stack I can use, let's talk about a better decision framework. Before any man thinks about peptides, I want 5 questions answered first. The first one being, what's the goal? Is it muscle strength, recovery, fat loss? All these things, they are not the same target. And if you can't even answer this one, that's probably a good sign you shouldn't even look at some of these peptides. The second question being, what's the bottleneck? Now, I talk about this a lot. And even as a doctor who works with hormones and peptides every single day, I really emphasize you focusing on your foundation first, which is your diet, your sleep, your stress management, and your exercise. You want these 4 things dialed in before you even touch anything that's advanced, even before touching something like supplements that I have behind me right here. You want to have your foundation on point first before you take the next step. And you need the context around you, right? Because peptides without context are upgraded, expensive guessing. If you have a broken foundation, you shouldn't decorate it with peptides or supplements. You should fix it first. Question 3 is, what's the baseline? Because if something changes later, you need a before and after. And it's nice to know how you feel, if you feel good, if you feel bad, if you feel energetic or not, but it's not objective. And you want something objective. You want labs, you want a proper baseline, maybe with even your weight, your HRV, your recovery. You can use something like an Aura ring, you can use a Whoop band, whatever, an Apple Watch. Just have a proper baseline before you start doing anything. So you can always go back and look at yourself and compare. Did you actually improve, or is it just something you're telling yourself? And then question 4 is, what could go wrong? This is doing a screening of risk. That means asking about your glucose sensitivity, fluid retention, your joint pain, your blood pressure, sleep apnea, like we said before. If you have sleep apnea, should you even think about something like this? What about your fertility goals? What about your medication history? And again, probably the most important thing here, with something that induces IGF-1 or has any effect on growth hormone, what about your cancer history? Both in your family, but also your own personal cancer history. You need to know the answers to these questions. And you need to understand that some of these things could go wrong. Because an amateur would always ask, what can I add to make this more advanced? But a serious professional would ask, what could go wrong? And what should make me stop? Is it if IGF-1 increases beyond the range you are accepting? Is it if your glucose tolerance worsens? Or is it if your sleep apnea becomes worse as well? And with that said, we already touched on question 5, because what is the stop rule? Again, an amateur will ask, what can I do to make this more advanced? What can I just add on top? But a serious man will ask himself, when should I stop? This is why the free peptide overview guide and decision matrix is the first link in the description. That's going to give you some more information around peptides in general, but also how you should think about the decision around something like this. Obviously only for information and educational purposes. If you ever start anything, I always recommend you speak with a professional, a doctor who works with this every single day. But since the information is out there, I wanted to help clarify and put some more answers to the questions I get every single day. If you know your problem is interpretation and monitoring, you could have a look at applying to work with me one-to-one. That's also one of the links in the description, or joining the Apex Performance Group program, where we can do this together in a group setting. This is definitely for men who has more money than they have time, and for men who are ready to take their health seriously and to the next level. So, but understand that these questions are still only the screening layer. We haven't even touched on the sequence, what to correct first, what to stop, what not to combine, and what happens when the rest of the hormones change. Understand that these are short YouTube videos, right? I can only give you 10%, 20% of my knowledge around some of these small topics. The rest is usually shared in the group programs or working with me one-to-one. But this should give you enough information to get started on your own, fixing the foundation, for example, first, and then seeing how much better you feel, and then making the decision, should I go to the next level by adding something more advanced, whether that is supplements or whether it's looking at something like peptides. And so now let me give you the practical takeaway, because this video should change how you think before it changes what you take. What men get wrong is they stack peptides just like a menu. CJC plus Ipamorelin for recovery, Tesamorelin for fat, IGF-LR3 for muscle gains, Follistatin for the extreme stuff. And that's how people think on Reddit, on X. But you should really think differently, because this is how we think in medicine. Because the pathway matters, but the man himself matters even more. If you're 42, you're training hard, you're sleeping bad, you're pushing a company, and you're carrying visceral fat around your stomach, and on top of that, you're waking up tired every single day, the peptide decision will simply not be the same as a 28-year-old bodybuilder who's looking to compete. And so even though these are the same compounds, they will have different risks associated to them. And this is why I keep making these videos, because I keep seeing serious men make unserious decisions because the internet made a protocol sound very advanced and a fit for all. But you shouldn't just start because it sounds advanced. You should also know when to stop and when to say no. So, download the free peptide overview guide and decision matrix. It's the first link in the description below. If you want something more deeper, something led by me with monitoring and interpretation, either the Apex Performance Group or the working with me one-to-one might be the correct decision for you. There are links for both of them in the description as well. And if this made you question whether peptides are even the right move for you, you should watch the next video on why men feel worse after 40, even though everything looks normal. Because if the baseline is wrong, everything advanced on top of it will be impossible to interpret correctly.